So welcome everyone. My name is Jillian Calder. I'm a professor at the law school and the chair of gender studies here at UVic, and I'm also a person who has had their life and their career impacted by these processes of silence. Here at UVic, territorial acknowledgement was prepared in consultation with the folk who are the stewards of these lands and the university, and so they asked us to read their statement. So I will read what the stewards of this land have asked us to read, which is, we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. We start with these words in order to start off our meeting in a good way, while also acknowledging the connections that exist between the kinds of ongoing colonial processes and the issues of marginalization that you'll be hearing about tonight. For those who want to know more about UVic and its territorial acknowledgement, there's a video made by Songhees elder Elmer George that's up on the university's homepage, welcoming visitors to these territories and giving us all the opportunity to listen to that welcome in the Lekwungen language. Very, very brief thank yous. Cole from Media Services, has enabled all sorts of fabulous things to happen already today, as well as we will be recording this session. Also thank you to the Faculty of Law and the Department of Gender Studies who have worked to be also part of this event tonight. And a reminder that there is food here, so please come down and have a snack, a coffee, a pastry of some kind while the event is going on. Please don't feel that you have to sit where you're sitting. The plan for today is as follows. We're going to start by watching a video together, and then I'm going to briefly introduce Julie Macfarlane, who will speak for about 7 minutes, according to Julie's rigorous schedule that I have been given. Then we'll be followed by Zelda Perkins, who will also speak for a few minutes. And then we'll see a second video together. Then MLA Sonia Furstenau will speak. And then our final speaker is Professor Charis Kamphuis. They've all asked me to pose a question after their talk, so we'll see how that goes. But really the plan here is for you to hear from them, and then we'll have about 40 minutes at the end for your questions and comments and engagement. We're all very fortunate to have this amazing panel of people here tonight. Thank you all for making time to come out. So with that, we'll start with the empty chair. Yeah.
One of the things we always try to do with our events is to remember all the people who can't speak, all the people who've signed NDAs and are unable to speak, unable to share what happened to them, and we want their voices to be heard here. So it's not a real substitute, but we do have a whole collection of testimonies, personal testimonies on our website, and we're going to just play you a little recording of those to start us off.
This whole process was horrific. I had already gone a year before signing the NDA and had refused to sign. The second time I went, I had no support, no legal representation, and faced an adjudicator who made disparaging comments about my motivation and pressured me to sign.
The company, the union, and I met for what I thought was arbitration, but when we gathered, the arbitration never started. I said no to mediation and no to an NDA for more than 8 hours. After 9.5 hours, I was broken. I wanted to go home. I was hungry, I was tired, I was traumatized. So I signed the NDA.
I agreed to hide a part of myself that needs to be healed. I live small because I feel I am not worth justice.
I was not given any time to negotiate the NDA. My PTSD became worse. I experienced anxiety and made 2 suicide attempts. I never returned to full-time employment. and my 10-plus year career as a skilled tradeswoman ended.
I tried to break my way out of the NDA. I thought if I break it before I'm even given any money, then I just won't receive the money, and that will be that. I didn't care about the money, but the NDA made me feel dirty and gross. The day the NDA was foisted on me, it felt like non-consensual sex. It felt like an assault. I felt violated. I felt like the NDA covered me in filth, and I wanted desperately to get it off of me.
Why does the legal system and many of our institutions continue to be so ignorant? The answer is simple. It's because they continue to protect abusers. I don't need to prove abusers are protected. In fact, I have physical evidence in the form of my non-disclosure agreement from 1997. A quarter century later, I still can't speak a great deal of truth about my own childhood.
As a Black woman, I had relinquished the right to speak my truth, to reach out to and support other Black employees who were experiencing the same racist treatment that I faced. After I signed the NDA, I overdosed. After that, the world felt like a darker and more cynical place.
I refused the settlement offer and insisted on going to arbitration. Partway through that process, and more than a year after my termination, I was again offered an agreement which I insisted I did not want for fear of the consequences. The agreement included an NDA and financial compensation. Over several weeks, my union rep and their lawyer repeatedly pressured me to accept and sign that agreement, suggesting the grievances could be withdrawn if I didn't. The lawyers and the union rep controlled the entire thing.
From my perspective, it was a tactic to get me to quit. I regret not seeking legal advice earlier. I was on the brink of an emotional breakdown, and I knew I had to get my life back on track. I gave in and signed the NDA. Looking back, I regret it. I wasn't in the proper state of mind to make such an important decision.
The next day I asked to be released. I said they knew I didn't want an NDA, that I had said no enough times, and that I was pressured into signing it. I was not released.
I was asked to sign an NDA to settle a sexual harassment complaint in my workplace. I didn't have a choice. The terms were presented to me and I wasn't allowed to change them. I needed the financial settlement because I'd lost my job due to discrimination, so I felt I had to sign.
Signing it caused me mental health issues. It made me feel like I didn't matter. I struggled starting new employment as I have to lie a lot about the past employer.
Having to sign an NDA was the first time I felt helpless, hopeless, and powerless. It was a feeling worse for me than the year and a half of sexual harassment I endured from my employer. I lost my job, I lost my voice, I became jaded and distrustful of all people in positions of power.
Universities that use NDAs to silence victims of sexual harassment only care about protecting their reputation and assets. He was the dean and is still a tenured professor. Most importantly, I learned that I don't matter.
I felt silenced, disempowered, and swept under the rug by the first NDA I signed. When I chose voice and refused to sign an NDA in the second situation, it meant further public attacks on my credibility. The confidentiality agreement still hangs over my head as a threat. NDAs are still seen as normal trade-off by lawyers.
I am a survivor of childhood physical and sexual abuse. After running away at 14 and not returning, I lived my life alone. Everyone knows about the abuse. It was only me who did not agree to forget about it. I'm not allowing this to go quietly into the archives. Canadian law is going to have to fix this one. My case is still before the courts. I would love to be the first person released from the NDA in Canada.
Our first speaker is Dr. Julie Macfarlane. She's worked at universities around the world for 40 years. She's an Emerita Distinguished University Professor at the University of Windsor and a member of the Order of Canada for her advocacy on access to justice and on behalf of survivors of sexual violence. Julie is co-founder with Zelda Perkins of Can't Buy My Silence, campaigning to make the misuse of non-disclosure agreements illegal. Her books include The New Lawyer in 2017, Islamic Divorce in North America 2012, and Going Public 2020. Please welcome Dr. Julie Macfarlane.
Thank you so much, Gillian, and thank you again to you, Vic, for hosting this evening. I think that many of us feel pretty choked up watching that, listening to that audio. But those are the real words of people who have been through these situations, and I think that there has been so much neglect of the impact of non-disclosure agreements on people's lives. And that is, of course, quite aside from the fact that they allow perpetrators to continue with whatever they have been doing in the first place that caused the harm. So when I was a teenager, I was an evangelical Christian. I was part of the Billy Graham generation. I don't know if there's anyone old enough here to remember that. And I started to feel like I was losing my faith. So I went to my minister, my church minister, to ask him, what should I do about that? And he said, God wants you to give me fellatio. Now, he didn't use the word fellatio because I wouldn't have had any idea what he was talking about, but that's what he wanted me to do. And he told me that that would sort out all my problems with my doubts about my faith. And this went on for almost 2 years until I finally, I left the church, but he still tracked me down constantly and repeated the assaults. When 40 years later, I finally got it together to go back and sue the Anglican Church, of which he was a member, one of the very first things I was told was that the Anglican Church would expect me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, to which I said, well, having waited 40 years to summon up the courage to make this public, I'm not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And that was literally the first time I had come across this. But oddly enough, within the next couple of years, I had a second experience, which involved my university. I was at the University of Windsor. And because I had been public about my own experiences, students started to come to me and tell me about a faculty member who, as many of us had been suspecting, had been sexually harassing our female students for many years. The university did the right thing initially. They suspended him, investigated him, and amazingly enough, terminated him because he was tenured, and that was a big deal. His termination letter was 3 pages long. This was a pretty extreme case of harassment and abuse of power. We were all very relieved until I began, about 6 months later, to hear from law schools in other countries, to whom he'd applied for employment, asking me, because these were people who knew me, knew my work, why did he leave the University of Windsor? It doesn't say why he left. And that was when the penny dropped and I realized they'd given him a non-disclosure agreement. I now have a copy of that. And of the letter of recommendation they gave him, which if you put it next to the letter of termination is kind of pretty wild, really. So I tried to persuade the University of Windsor that they should stop doing this. That seemed to me to be a complete no-brainer, given what was now happening. They refused, and I resigned in disgust. So my title still includes the University of Windsor, but in some ways I would like to erase it entirely. But the work that I've done over so many years has often centered on the fact that people get taken advantage of and exploited when they don't know enough about the law, and they also can't afford a lawyer. Most people can't afford a lawyer in Canada. And as a result, they are put in very vulnerable situations. And I think non-disclosure agreements are a perfect example of that, because what they essentially are is a fraud on the public. There are a whole bunch of myths and misinformation out there about NDAs, and I'm just going to scratch the surface with a few of those and what the real story is. So one is that NDAs give people closure. Now, if you say that to a room full of survivors, they will laugh at you, because obviously what it really is an albatross around their necks. They can't speak to their family, their friends, to a therapist or a counselor, to their spiritual advisor, etc. NDAs, another myth is, give victims more money. There are a couple of lawyers in Canada who do sexual harassment cases who are constantly telling me that I'm taking money away from victims if I want to ban NDAs. Now, maybe for a very, very tiny number of very high-profile clients, silence has a number attached to it. But given that the average sexual harassment settlement is less than $10,000, I can assure you people aren't getting more money for their silence. And even if they were getting more money for their silence, which they're not, since when did we pay for silence? We're supposed to be paying in the legal system for damages, for harm that has been done to somebody. Another myth, if you don't sign, and we heard this in some of the testimonies, we'll take you to court. Well, think about it. The party who wants you to sign is the same party that doesn't want any of this to be public. And court or tribunal is public. So in actual fact, if we found that in many cases, and obviously lots of people can't do this because they need the money quickly, because they're not emotionally able, understandably, to wait that long. But when people dig in their heels, they often get their settlement without the NDA. In other words, it's all another bluff. And, you know, the biggest bluff of all in this is that they're signing a legal document. These are almost entirely unenforceable contracts. We're starting to see a little bit of case law now with the notorious Trump NDAs in the States. But there are so many things in so many of these NDAs that are not enforceable, which show signs of undue pressure and coercion, which will void a contract. There are all kinds of common law rules that make these unenforceable. But rather than spend years and years trying to bring cases through the courts, what we are delighted to be able to be doing in British Columbia with the assistance of Sonia Furstenau is to bring legislation forward which will fix the problem. So I'm going to leave it at that, but lots more information if you're interested on the disproportionate impact on vulnerable people, on women, on minorities, on people who are disabled. We have a lot of data now because we've collected a great deal. Thank you.
So, Julie, as someone who's worked in a university context for many years and as a powerful advocate for access to justice, I'm wondering what you think role that legal education might play in this. Like, as someone who has had a hand in the development of people who go on to hold the kind of power that law students do.
Right. Great question. Well, I think we should be teaching law students about the things that are part of the culture of the legal profession that we would encourage them not to do. And there are many of them. NDAs is one of them, but there are many other aspects to legal practice which legal practice is seen as something that doesn't dispense empathy. It's not about moral support. It's all about technical advice with very little idea of the context that any one particular person is experiencing. And for that reason, I developed a class in my last 5 years or so called Clients. And it was the first course in North America in any law school that taught students about clients, which I found totally amazing. And of course, it doesn't exist any longer because I'm not there anymore. I think that we should be, I have friends still in law schools who teach contracts. We should be setting exam questions about what do you do when you find that somebody has signed an NDA? What do you do if the other side wants your client to sign an NDA? So that this actually becomes part of what students are thinking about and their ethical responsibilities in practice before they go out into the world.
Thank you, and we'll all have a chance to ask Julie questions at the end, so hold on to your questions. Our next speaker is Zelda Perkins. Zelda was the first woman to break an NDA in 2017, signed decades earlier with Harvey Weinstein. She brought the systemic abuse of NDAs to the attention of the British government and international press, giving evidence at 2 parliamentary inquiries, and that led to disciplinary action. Her actions have inspired many others to come forward by example. She has been campaigning for legislative and regulatory reform in the UK since 2017 and launched the global campaign, Can't Buy My Silence, with co-founder Julie Macfarlane in September of 2021. Zelda was named a Person of the Year by Time Magazine in 2018, by The Guardian in 2020, and by the UN Women UK in 2023. She was portrayed by Samantha Morton in the award-winning film She Said, documenting her role in the downfall of Harvey Weinstein. Zelda, over to you.
Thanks, that was quite embarrassing. Nobody usually reads out the whole thing. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I've been feeling quite jealous about your beautiful campus, having not gone to a campus university. So I think this is the first time I've actually sat and heard the empty chair done at an event. Obviously, I've read all of those testimonies that all come from our website, and our website has a facility for people to give their testimony, which has been a hugely powerful and cathartic space, because for most people it's the first and probably the only time that they talk about the experience they had. Listening to that, I hope for most of you it was pretty shocking. For Julie and I, it's what we hear every single day. And actually, it was a very good cross-section of the feelings and the clauses that might be put in an NDA, in terms of certainly the experience I had 30 years ago now, because pretty much every single thing that you heard in those testimonies was an experience that I went through in that short period of time where I was negotiating, not an NDA, but a damages agreement when Harvey Weinstein assaulted my assistant. And we went to the law, presuming that we would have justice would be, justice would come in and save us, and the predator would be jailed. I mean, we imagined that we would have to go through a pretty horrible court process, and I think anybody who followed the Weinstein trial or who's followed any trials of women who have been sexually assaulted have seen what a very complex and re-traumatizing process that is, which is one of the reasons people don't come forward. I think for me, I was in a fortunate position in a way because I wasn't a direct victim of assault. I was a direct victim of harassment, but I can tell you in 1998 we didn't have language for sexual harassment. That was just normal behaviour. I don't think any woman, and we were discussing this earlier today, I don't think any woman, certainly no contemporary of mine, has not experienced some form of sexual harassment or inappropriate behaviour, not just in a job, I mean before a job, but certainly once you reach employment. And when I started working for Harvey Weinstein, nobody told me that he was a predator or a harasser, but I was told that, to keep my puffer jacket on, not to sit on a sofa next door to him, not to accept a massage off him. Now, everybody looks really shocked at those things, but actually that was quite a normal thing for people to say to you when you start a new job. There's always like, oh, don't go into the photocopy room with Bob. Handsy Bob. And that would be the warning. But that didn't mean that you thought that there was a rapist amongst, your office workers. In the non-disclosure agreement that my colleague and I ended up signing, we were not allowed to speak to friends, family, associates, work associates, future employers, etc., which is a very common and, what you would expect to be in a non-disclosure agreement. However, we also weren't allowed to speak to a therapist. We weren't allowed to speak to a priest. We weren't allowed to speak to the police. We weren't allowed to speak to the HMRC, who are our tax office. If any of our friends who we might have disclosed something to disclose something, we would be liable for that disclosure. Now, as Julie said, very few of those clauses are and would be enforceable. But that doesn't really matter, because this is private contract, which we all have a right to have. But when it takes your voice away, and when it is hidden in total confidentiality, that means you can write anything in there. You could write they'll, murder your dog if you speak about it, and you don't know whether that's true or not. Particularly when you're in a vulnerable situation, and the person who's asking this of you tends to be in charge of your finances. They employ you. They're in charge of your livelihood. It wasn't until 23 years later that a lawyer told me, and not told me before I broke the agreement, but told me after I broke the agreement, that many of those clauses were unenforceable. Now, I had, in that room, when I negotiated that non-disclosure agreement, I had fantastic legal support. I had a great legal team, I had a QC, I had, one of the best QCs in the country, and yet I was still told to sign an agreement that essentially took away my basic human rights, my colleague's right to own her own trauma, to go to any form of therapy to recover, an agreement saying that I had to use my best endeavours not to speak to the police. Now, for me, this was the biggest issue. Humans are weak. We have a dark side and a light side, and people in power, we live in a culture and a society that, that is sycophantic to power and fame. And the more power you have, the more you seem to be able to abuse. And in the case of my agreement, what I could see was that the law was totally purchasable. It had nothing to do with justice, had nothing to do with right or wrong. We have law to protect us from ourselves because we are weak. And if the law isn't working, then we have a moral responsibility to do something about it. It is the only thing that we can change. Now, you would think that 30 years on, things would have changed. But when I broke my non-disclosure agreement in 2017, I discovered that it was exactly the same landscape. There has been no change in British law, apart from whistleblowing protections. And when I spoke and begged for the legal regulators to change guidance, because I felt like lawyers needed help to do the right thing, I was told that they're trying to make guidance less prescriptive, not more prescriptive. Now, I was saying earlier today, to me, this is a problem that actually legislation is needed to back it up. But essentially, this is about the integrity of law. It's about the abuse of power, and it's about not using a perfectly legitimate legal tool, which protects IP and trade secrets, to hide abuse, any form of abuse. And so if the law sector, if students were educated properly and the law sector changed their guidance, it would actually, not only would it stop that form of abuse of the law, but it would also make people self-regulate their behaviour. Because if you don't have a tool to hide your abuse, you're not going to do that abuse in the first place. How am I doing time-wise? Am I almost there? Okay. I'm never very good at timing myself. So very quickly, Julie and I came across each other during lockdown, and as we always say, a very dangerous time to leave two quite cross women with not much to do. So Julie told me her story, and it was a use of NDAs that I had not heard about before. I had got had a jump start because of Me Too in the UK in terms of getting traction on this issue. But lockdown, rather cauterised all of that, and we had a change in leadership to, I think, our version of Donald Trump, but with white hair. And so Julie and I came together to start Can't Buy My Silence. And as I say, it was lockdown, we were a bit bored, so we decided that this needed to be global, and this needed to be across all sectors about everything, not just about sexual harassment, although that's the most accessible piece of legislation generally that we can work on, but non-disclosure agreements across every sector, every section of society. And ultimately, the litmus test is if an agreement is stopping you from talking about something that can cause harm, any form of harm to anyone else, then it is wrong and it should not be signed. And everyone should have the knowledge that they're doing the correct thing, and the right will happen if you say no to that.
Thank you. I think for many of us in the room, the bravery that you're showing is staggering. And I think there are some of us wondering a little bit about, you know, in the face of trying to change every sector of everything, what are some of the things that we can take on that would affect these cultures of change? Like, what are the kind of things that we can do on a daily basis?
Well, I think arming yourself with knowledge, you know, certainly, you know, my experience, and a very common experience with everybody who's put into a negotiating situation with any form of contract, but particularly one which is going to remove or place confidentiality over you, is that I think we all believe that lawyers, anything a lawyer says is true. So I would encourage everybody to always question your lawyer, whatever it's to do with. And I'm not suggesting that lawyers are bad, I'm just suggesting that they become a little complacent in their vague superiority of knowledge, which they have because we don't spend years at law school, but they speak a different language, a language that we don't speak and is very obfuscatory to us and very frightening to us. And never be afraid to ask for clarity, because often when you ask for clarity, things change very quickly. And when you push back, things change very quickly. And I think most people don't think that they're allowed to do that. So I think that's a really important thing. And a little plug for our website, obviously, here, is that there's a huge amount of information on the website on how to do that and what really your rights are. And I think, you know, knowledge is power. Yes, knowledge is power. And so, you know, never be rushed and always arm yourself with knowledge. And if you have friends or you know people who are being put into these situations, tell them to take time, tell them to look at our website, tell them to ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. I think that's probably the most important bit of advice I'd ever give anybody.
Thank you.
So we have another little video to play. Well, this is video, not audio. One of the exciting things that has happened in the last couple of years as we've been trying to get these bills introduced in provinces around Canada, because as I have had to explain to Zelda, we don't just have one law here that, you know, covers everybody who's employed. We have a lot of provinces and territories, as well as the federal government. One of the places where the bill got to committee stage, which is where it's been approved at second reading, and then there is a small group of members of that parliamentary legislature who consider it in detail, was Manitoba. And because the committee sits inside Parliament and is governed by parliamentary privilege, that meant that we could galvanize a whole group of people who had signed NDAs and had never spoken about them. They were fearful about talking about them. They could go and testify before this committee, and they could break their NDAs with impunity. So in the end, I think the committee session was something like 5.5 hours long. It went on until like 1 o'clock in the morning, and we're going to play the whole darn thing. No, we have a 5-minute excerpt, so we're going to show you the 5-minute excerpt just to give you another sense of what people are saying about their experience. So this is the committee stage in Manitoba.
Part of the settlement included a non-disclosure agreement which prevented me from ever discussing what happened between me, Mr. Ailes, or the other executives whom I had named in my suit. I cannot tell you the pain of being silenced and unable to share your trauma with anyone, especially with other survivors. This is what NDAs do. They isolate. They prevent survivors from sharing their experiences or warning others about an abuser in their midst. They protect predators by covering up toxic behavior. This is not the kind of society any of us wants to live in, either on my side of the border or on yours.
That incident shrank to a very few sentences in the column, and I could only report on NIGARD's version of events. Why? Because the three women had settled. The Human Rights Commission then did not proceed with the case, and the women all signed non-disclosure agreements. That was in 1997. NIGARD was then 56, and today he's 80. In the ensuing quarter century, he assaulted multiple women and girls in the US, Canada, and the Bahamas. Canadian and US authorities have accused him of sex trafficking and racketeering. Now imagine a world without NDAs, where the victims are not gagged. Imagine a quarter century ago if those three brave women who went to the Manitoba Human Rights Commission could have spoken freely to me. This is the damage of NDAs. It gives free rein to predators, it creates more victims and more ruined lives.
I remained with my employer until I retired in 2018. On my last day of employment, the union president hugged me and stated that what management had done was almost criminal. On management's side, there were no well wishes, which was not surprising. I had been silenced by them through the many years, both formally and informally, through various means ranging from the signing of confidentiality agreements to marginalization to bullying. Non-disclosure agreements, unless used for the purpose of protecting intellectual property, often hurt the party who needs the most protection. In my case, the forced silence put upon me only served to empower those who chose to malign me, damaging me both personally and professionally.
It was my only option. There was no justice in the 90s. There still is no justice. I had the choice of going for the money. I mean, I was 25 years old, 3 children, we had a mortgage up to the eyeballs. I needed this $30,000 to cover the therapy or we were going to sink as a family. At that point, I had to sign that NDA.
My last years at Digital Health ended up being a terrible and traumatizing workplace experience. I started to experience racism as far back as 2008 during the residential school apology. I was terminated on March 2nd, 2021. I was offered $40,000, then $60,000, and then $80,000 with $5,000 in manner of dismissal damages. I have not signed any release papers, which include a non-disclosure agreement, and have yet to receive proper compensation and recognition of these horrible experiences. NDAs isolate victims who are prohibited from sharing information about their situations and can hinder the healing process after an assault or other forms of abuse. Because the allegations are not made public, the agreements protect the perpetrators of these abuses, leaving them free to continue their behavior. One problematic trend is this idea of using NDAs in almost all incidents. For example, using NDAs to prevent women or men from speaking out about alleged history of inappropriate or abusive behavior.
As a child, I did not believe I would get any justice. And even going through that process, I didn't really feel that I was ever going to get justice. Basically, the lawyer said that, and I also kind of knew as well. I was offered a $50,000 settlement, and I was told that both my mother and myself would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I refused to have my mother sign the non-disclosure agreement because she was not a part of this. I had one day to decide that by my father's counsel. I refused, and I find that a little victory for myself at that time. I had to wait 3 weeks, and then they said, okay, we'll just want you to sign the release and non-disclosure agreement. At that point, I just wanted it to end. It was so difficult, and I couldn't go further. And also, I had no full idea what I was signing. So I did not know that it was going to be permanent. My father died in 2015, and even though he is dead now, I am still held to that non-disclosure agreement.
When people are fired, or they are abused, or they are sexually assaulted, or they are harassed, the payment is for the bad behavior. As legislators, I hope that you will not allow any more to have payment for silence. They they make these two elements sort of be the same thing. And it's so important that they have to pay because they treated you badly. But don't elide this with a gag order.
Just having a law prohibiting NDAs will create an entirely new culture of accountability. So it's not about us needing laws to punish the people causing these harms. Just knowing that this information cannot be suppressed forever in a legal agreement might be just enough to change behaviors within workplaces, within corporations, whatever it is. Not being able to do that anymore, people's behaviors will change, and that's why it's so important that this act pass.
Okay, our next speaker, so well planned, is Sonia Furstenau, who is a member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia for Cowichan Valley and the leader of the BC Green Party. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Had it there for a moment. Sonia was first elected in BC in 2017. Her constituency work is focused on continued efforts to protect the Cowichan Valley watersheds, facilitating conversations between government and community groups about child wellness, advocating for updated infrastructure in health and education, and supporting Indigenous leadership. Sonia has long been involved in grassroots advocacy on many issues, including anti-poverty, microcredit, climate change. In March of 2023, she tabled legislation in the BC legislature that would ban the use of non-disclosure agreements in cases of harassment and discrimination, a move that has properly been called a fundamental shift in justice. Sonia.
Thank you. I feel very honored to be at this table. I remember the first time I was on a panel with you, Julie and Zelda. You came in by Zoom, and we watched a screening of She Said. If you haven't watched She Said yet, go watch it tonight. But we got to the end of the screening, and we had to come to the front of the room, and I was whooping. I was like, woo! Like, don't we all want to whoop now? Like, this is amazing. And now to be again sitting with you, but to have spent the day with Julie and Zelda today and reintroduce the bill, I feel so fortunate to be in the company of two quite cross women. In fact, it's my favorite company to be in. I think we might also be two quite cross women right here. And more, I think about my time in the legislature. It was a really nice description, but I think I can shorthand it. I'm in the legislature to toss the table. I am so tired of what's normalized. And this is such an example of the wrong thing being normalized in our society, in our culture. It's normalized that women, we all know that we have to find ways to protect ourselves in our workplaces. We all know about, stay away from Bob in the photocopy room. We all know that we are going to experience these occasions that are, jaw-dropping or distressing or terrible, all of these things. And what's normalized is we just all carry on, and so do they. And today at lunch, Zelda, when I said how courageous I thought you were, you said, no, don't say that. What I'm doing is normal. Let's normalize speaking the truth. Yeah. Let's normalize people coming out and refusing to accept these conditions that we've all had to accept for way too long. I have on the whiteboard, and my team is here. Hello, wonderful team. Katie and Rose and Laura and Emily. Miriam is here. This is the small but mighty BC Green team. And Sarah, I didn't see her. And Sarah, I'm so sorry. But, I get the credit for all of this, but really none of this happens without these incredible people who are normalizing hard and diligent work in a BC legislature and refusing to accept the kind of political rhetoric and nonsense that really is so much of what our time is spent on in that building. But we have on the whiteboard, who is being protected? Who are we protecting? That's the question I always want us to start by asking. And with NDAs, of course, we're protecting the wrong people. We're protecting the perpetrators. And we're continually re-victimizing the people who have been victimized. And we keep normalizing that equation. And it was so easy to agree to work with Julie and Zelda and to introduce the legislation in March last year and then to reintroduce it today because it makes perfect sense. I've been drawn into politics because I've been so disappointed that governments continually protect the wrong people, the wrong organizations. They don't protect the public. They don't protect the people who are most marginalized. They don't protect our future, our environment. When we were fighting for our watershed in Shawnigan Lake, my favorite photo is of Bruce Stevens, one of my neighbors, holding a sign, Ministry of Environment, who are you protecting? Because they weren't protecting the people of Shawnigan Lake with the decision to put a contaminated landfill in our watershed. And I think when we ask that question, we make it that simple, and that's what Julie, you and Zelda have done, is just put this question in front of all of us. And when I reflect on how little I knew about NDAs, it makes so much sense because NDAs create this black hole of silence. And hearing the testimony from the people in Manitoba, and then hearing they didn't pass the legislation, toss the table. It takes a long time to make real change, but it's worth it, and it's essential work. And I'm so grateful to you two. And grateful to all of you for being here. And we will just keep pushing for this change. The opportunity that exists now, I don't expect that government's going to debate our private members bill and pass it in the next 7 days. Although I'd love to be surprised. But the opportunity that exists now is in the upcoming election to ask every candidate and every party, will you commit to passing this legislation should you form government? And then demanding that they answer that in a direct and straightforward way. And if they say no, I would hope put your vote and your support elsewhere. Thank you.
Can we ask you, Sonia, just to tell us a little bit about what the bill says, just so we have a sense of...
So I have some notes put together by my wonderful team. I've got the bill. I had the bill in front of me before, but so the bill would restrict the use and content of non-disclosure agreements related to acts and allegations of discrimination or harassment, and sets out strict criteria that NDAs must meet in cases of discrimination and harassment, including requiring that the victim request an agreement without coercion or pressure, allowing them to access a lawyer before signing, allowing them to waive the agreement later, and making NDAs time-limited. And why? Because discrimination and harassment happen to people far too often, and we do not have a framework of transparency that protects the victims. So this is a piece of legislation that protects the right people in the equation.
Thank you. Our fourth speaker is Charis Kamphuis, an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at Thompson Rivers University. She's the co-founder of a national clinical program called the Justice and Corporate Accountability Project. And in this capacity, she's worked for more than a decade with law students, lawyers, and academics across Canada and abroad to do legal work and research for communities who are adversely affected by harmful resource extraction. At present, she's practicing as an attorney with the Defending Defenders program at the Environmental Law Alliance Worldwide, ELAW. Welcome, Charis.
Thanks, Julian. Yeah, I prepared written notes for today, and part of the reason is because a few of the comments have been that it's my first time speaking about this, and it's my first time speaking about this particular content. And I also want to make really good use of the time and be very precise. But I just have to also give some recognition to the folks on this panel. I just love the image of you tossing the table. And, every time I hear you speak on the CBC or I hear about the work you're doing, Sonia, I just feel so comforted knowing that there are women like you in politics in our community. And I try to imagine the toll that takes on you personally and the amount of work that you're doing. I'm just incredibly grateful for you and also, of course, for this work and all the other good work. Zelda, the same, of course. I mean, it's just, I think for many of us here, obviously, you're a very famous person. It's great to have you in the room and behind this campaign. I'm so happy that you met Julie and that you guys are working together. And I think the thing when I watched She Said, which was, it's an amazing film, the thing that really spoke to me was the journalists, actually, because their story of searching for truth, of supporting survivors, really resonated with what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll get there in a second. And then Julie, you have been such an amazing support person for me for, I don't know if it's 2, 3, I can't even remember how many years now we've been at this. You just, and I know how many other people you support, and you do so much. You are such an inspiration, and I feel so lucky to have met you and that you're in my orbit, so thank you. And it's actually my first time meeting Julie in person, so I feel like we know each other really well, but anyway, so today I'm going to tell a story about one of my experiences with NDAs in the university setting, and yes, I actually have more than one story to tell on this topic, which says a lot about why this event is important and why this work it needs to be done. NDAs are all too common in universities, which is, of course, why we need the legislation, but also I hope we'll have time today to talk about the university pledge. We need universities and all institutions really to get on board as fast as possible because really the people in power can decide that they don't want to do NDAs in their organization and they can stop. So it's not just that we need legislation, we also need good leadership. In 2014, I was hired as a tenure-track professor at Thompson Rivers University, Faculty of Law, and I quickly became an active member of the community, making many wonderful friendships, and particularly with women in leadership and middle management positions. And I mention this because this is really how my story begins, with women talking to each other in friendship and in solidarity. So, 6 years later in 2020, I slowly began to learn that there were many individuals with allegations of bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, and discriminatory conduct on the part of 2 senior leaders in the university. One of the leaders, who's the focus of the story for today, was the executive director of the Human Resources Office, or HR. So the individuals who shared these experiences believed that the behavior was a pattern and that it was a kind of open secret in the university and in the broader community. They also felt strongly that it was unacceptable for senior leaders to be behaving this way, much less in a university, but at the same time, they were all very fearful about the prospect of complaining, and they had very little trust in the university's leadership. So at first, I didn't know what to do with this information that I was receiving, but together with a handful of trusted allies, we formed a group calling ourselves Concerned Members of the Community, and we mutually committed to supporting any complainants who wished to bring their allegations forward. However, we were also very concerned to ensure that complainants would not experience further harm or retaliation. At first, we considered the strategy of bringing complainants, or of complainants bringing their concerns to the university president, given that both of the men accused were in very senior roles. But then we found out that the president had been involved in an NDA that covered up the allegations, or that purported to. So how did we find this out? Well, I reached out to the former associate director of HR. Her name is Amanda, because she had suddenly disappeared from her position in the HR office. I'll never forget the day that we walked and talked and she told me about her experience. I learned that months prior, she had filed a wide-ranging complaint against her then boss, the executive director of HR. Her allegations involved rampant sexual harassment and discriminatory conduct, similar to the allegations that I had already heard from others. She told me that after she filed the complaint, she began to experience significant retaliation on the part of the same individual, the executive director. At that stage, with her underlying complaint still unresolved, she wrote repeatedly to members of the executive for help, the responsible VP, the general counsel, and the university president. When she received no help at all, and as the retaliation continued, her mental health significantly deteriorated. She got a lawyer, wrote to the university saying that she had been constructively dismissed and requested compensation. The next day, literally the next day, the general counsel and the VP sent her a settlement offer with an NDA. It contained a non-disclosure and a non-disparagement clause. This meant that it purported to silence her in two ways. First, from speaking about her allegations, and second, from speaking negatively at all about the university or any of its employees. In other words, and I've seen this, like Julie, I've seen the agreement. In other words, the agreement purported to forever silence her free expression rights with respect to any topic related to TRU. At this stage, Amanda felt she had no choice but to sign the NDA. Following her complaint, the workplace had become totally unbearable, and her repeated requests for help from the university's leaders were ignored. After Amanda signed the NDA and left the university, the president and the VP in question actually promoted the ED of HR to the position of Associate Vice President, People and Culture. In other words, not only did, I know, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't actually lived it. In other words, not only did they fail to investigate, but they promoted the alleged perpetrator. The rest is a very long story, but ultimately, after many months of negotiations, we were able to convince the university's Board of Governors to convene an investigation. Part of those negotiations involved pushing the university to waive the NDA so that Amanda and others, there were other NDAs, could participate. In the end, Amanda and 7 others participated, and many of their complaints of sexual harassment and discrimination, including discrimination based on pregnancy and indigeneity, were substantiated. The investigators found that the behavior of the ED of HR had created a poisoned work environment. Of course, I'm sharing this story with Amanda's permission, but I'm also able to share it in this way because recently TRU took the rare step of publicly disclosing large portions of the final investigation report. Certain parts of the report reflect the story that I've told here, that Amanda's initial sexual harassment discrimination complaint was never investigated properly, that her retaliation complaint was never investigated at all. Yet in spite of this, TRU has taken no steps to discipline or sanction those individuals who failed to investigate and allowed the conduct to continue. So as some of you might imagine, and as some of you know, this is only the fragment of a much larger story, but I hope for today it's helpful to illustrate how NDAs can function perpetrators, including sort of close to home in our university context in this province. And I hope it also illustrates how there's a tight connection between the failure to properly investigate, which it's important to know knowledge is power is a violation of the Human Rights Code. The failure to investigate is a violation of the Human Rights Code. And NDAs. So, I guess I'll just wrap up by saying, in addition to the work on NDAs, there's a lot to do to address the systemic problem of deeply flawed and biased workplace investigations, as well as the threat and the reality of malicious lawsuits, we already talked about that, that intend to punish and silence complainants. And there's also a pressing need to combat the cultural stigma that whistleblowers and complainants face. And I'm sure we could talk about how we've all felt that, and it's awful. So all of these struggles are interconnected, and the effort to ban NDAs, in my view, is a crucial starting point. And I'm just grateful for the fact that we're here today talking to each other, and I think that that's something to take power in spite of all this really heavy content. So thank you all for being here.
I'm wondering if you can just, knowing your story as I do, I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit more about the importance of allyship in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, that might make me cry. I just, from, the things that I've been through, this story is only, like I said, part of the story, and I've been through a lot of other things in the last little while. And yeah, I don't think anyone would be here without that. Like, it's the survival that we need, and, the women that support me, and, obviously my family, and my network of friends and allies is so deep and so broad, and yet at the same time, I need it all the time. It's kind of wild how much support we all need to do this work, and yeah, I'm just so grateful, and that's, the free labor that we do for each other. And, I think, there's a lot of times, and, people in my life have asked me, do you regret it, supporting these individuals to come forward? And as much as it's, there's so much sacrifice and there's a lot of risk. But, I think when you're in those situations, you just feel like there's no other choice. I think that was kind of said here, like, what else are you going to do? It feels awful to do nothing, and it's really hard to do something. But, we have to do it. I think you just have those moments where you have to do it. And for me, anyways, it's essential that it's part of a community. So good question, Jillian.
So I know you all have questions. So what I'm just going to do is have you turn to your neighbor or people sitting around you. What is the question that you want to ask now? What's the thing that you really want to say? So just say it to your neighbor, and then we'll take up questions to the large group. So go ahead, 1 minute.
I know. Very. The timing.
I actually
just one or two.
And I'm kind of embarrassed that I don't even know remember her name now.
About teaching.
And it was right before you hired, I think, your chief of staff.
Thank you for your own staff.
Yeah.
When I say you're great race managers, I take Haley.
No, I know. It always feels very ungrateful saying that. But I just, it's so important because that's frightening to other people. Because other people go, well, I can't be brave.
And I think actually it's
Yes.
I can't do that.
Exactly.
So she's doing that. I think the message is And the thing I loved about what she said, because I love those terms and decided, because I was thinking about all this business. And there's no way that when we're in university had a conversation about who was going to do childcare.
But that's also, that's also, I think, why the movie wasn't commercially successful, because it was showing reality rather than, showing a macho, like, competitive environment.
I would stay out of the it was such a good
And what Jodie and Megan did was extraordinary.
And it was,
and you don't really see in the movie how because also it's shortened. That was over months. I spoke to them in July. The story didn't get released until October. But, they'd already been working on it for months before that, and they were racing with Ronan Farrow.
All right, I don't want to interrupt your conversations, but I'm going to call you back. Who would like to? I'll try to do this. Who would like to ask a question of our panelists? Yes, and maybe you can just. Well, yeah, go ahead.
I could just ask you this in the car later, that's fine too. Bill S-261 was introduced in the Senate in October 2023, and it was such a rad bill to see introduced, but it's still in second review phase, and we all know that the internet does not give us as critical updates as those back and forth emails. So can you spill some tea on where this bill is at right now and the conversations that you've had with Senator McFedrin?
Well, the bill is still at first reading. It hasn't had second reading yet. And the difficulty is that in the Senate, if you don't have a party affiliation, and Mary Lou is an independent senator, you don't get any allotted time. So you have to depend on the grace and favor of the other parties, and there has been no grace and favor. We did, however, have some really, we were in Ottawa last week, myself and Zelda, meeting with politicians there. And we did get a very positive sense from everybody we talked to. And, you know, when I say that, I think we both have fairly good bullshit radar. And, you know, when you actually explain to people and set out what these are doing and what they mean, then, you know, there is genuine shock. And I think we met a couple of Bloc MPs who said that they would sponsor it if it could get to the Commons. We had an amazingly positive conversation with one of the Conservative Party members. I mean, they're really excited because tomorrow the CBC chair is going to be questioned by the Heritage Committee about the CBC's use of NDAs, which are prolific. I mean, I've heard from so many CBC people in the last couple of months, so they're just really excited about doing down the CBC. But we also met with the Minister of Justice, the Attorney General, Arif Virani, who I have spoken to before and is very supportive. So really this is a matter of, can we make Justin Trudeau feel guilty enough about the fact that public civil servants aren't protected from these things, and they are everywhere in the public civil service, that he will do the right thing before the next election.
And I think the other thing that we managed to spread very effectively was that Mary Lou is very keen for anybody to steal that bill.
Yes, steal my bill.
Yeah, steal the bill. Yeah, steal the bill.
Just explain what the bill does.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Well, the bill is very straightforward, actually. It says that the public money, in other words, anything that has to get accounted for through the Public Accounts Committee, cannot be used to either create or to enforce an NDA. So it would also release everybody who's already signed one. It also says that where they are being used, and again, there's the kind of exception set out that the bill that Sonia is bringing forward has, where there are NDAs used, where there is a claim that this is, you know, the request of the victim, that they've had full advice, they still choose it over one-sided confidentiality, then there has to be a reporting annually to Parliament of how many NDAs and how much money they spent on them. And I think this will diminish a lot.
And I think it's quite hard for a government to argue that they are condoning and happy to use public funds to silence people who've been abused. I mean, I'm not quite sure how anybody can argue that well in government. Yeah. I'd like to see that.
Yeah, nobody was arguing about that with us last week. Yeah.
No.
Just a quick follow-up. Did you get a chance to meet with Sebastian Lemieux of the Bloc?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
Yes, he was one of the people who said that he would be willing to sponsor it in the Commons.
Beauty. Okay, I'm so relieved to hear that.
I'm just wondering if, in Quebec we have a hybrid civil system, but in the rest of Canada we're unfortunately stuck with common law. Do you think that switching to a civil law system might help move this kind of legislation forward? Because it's very, very difficult for people to defend themselves under a common law system which is so dependent on case law.
Yes. Well, I mean, although it's taking us a while to get these bills actually passed, and I should say that PEI did pass the legislation back in 2022, and sort of reflecting a little bit of what Charis was saying, the president of Prince Edward Island University mysteriously resigned the following day. I don't know what that had to do with it. So they have passed it. So what I was going to say is that despite the fact this is taking, you know, it's a long thing to go through every province, I still think it's going to be much quicker than trying to persuade Common Law Canada to adopt the civil law.
I'm just thinking that, you know, in the longer term, I just don't see that common law promotes justice.
No, there's I mean, the civil system codifies these kinds of principles in a much more accessible way. We are also talking to people in Quebec. Yeah. There's some possibility that there might be a bill coming forward there. Yeah.
First of all, thank you all so much for speaking. It was wonderful to hear each of your perspectives. This question is kind of, I guess, shifting to a different timeline, but I have a friend who's a professional athlete and kind of worked her whole life to get to that point. And when she was taken on by Nike, along with a standard form contract, it was a non-disclosure of the terms of the contract. And I wanted to kind of get your perspective on how that affects the freedom to contract, and with someone who at the time could not afford legal representation and was kind of given a take it or leave it scenario, what that kind of does.
You're all looking at me again.
We're all looking at the lawyer.
Okay. Well, if anything in the contract with Nike was about protecting proprietary information, trade secrets of Nike's, like the design of the new sneaker before it's on the market, then that would fall into what NDAs were originally created to do, to protect those kinds of proprietorial intellectual property interests. However, it's completely unnecessary for any other reason for there to be an NDA in there. And I mean, this illustrates a problem that we see all the time, which is lawyers just put these NDAs into everything now. And I'm not saying that makes them evil. Zelda might disagree, but it's a habit. It's a really bad habit. And a lot of legal practice is just using the template from the last time, et cetera, et cetera. But there is absolutely no reason for there to be an NDA in there unless your friend was actually going to be given sort of advance information about things that they would say was part of their trade secret.
It was on like salary and things like that, like not able to get, what she said, she's like, I'm not able to get industry standard or talk about what my pay is or what like terms of a potential maternity policy would be. Not able
that's clearly wrong. And I mean, when I mentioned earlier on that there's this myth floating around that NDAs give people more money, the converse is actually the case, because the NDA can also conceal the amount of the settlement. And that means that people frequently get less than what their statutory entitlement might be. So there's no reason for that clause to be there.
I can add to that. I think that the habit that both Julie and Zelda are talking about is a habit increasingly of government, right? Yeah. And it's a way to, to command and control information, to keep people very unable to speak about what they're talking about. And in a democracy, it really corrodes the fundamentals of democratic behavior, which is transparency, accountability. When we think about the bigger picture here, one of the words I put down was consequences, right? So a lot of people are not facing the consequences for their actions. But when you look at it at an institutional level and consider the ways in which governments are using these, it means that governments also don't face consequences, or you can't have the kind of accountability that builds trust in between the public and the government. So that's another big concern, and I wonder whether that's part of the reluctance of governments to move forward with these pieces of legislation that are being championed by Julie and Zelda, is that it forces them to look at their own behaviors and actions in the use of NDAs.
Absolutely. And just one other point to you, who asked the question. We think about NDAs in resolution, and that's what we have mostly talked about, but we also see them as was mentioned at the beginning of an investigation and to silence people who are going through that process. We also see them in pre-hiring, which is effectively what was happening with your friend, that people are told they have to sign a contract of hire that says they will never, ever speak about anything that ever goes on in the workplace before anything bad has even happened. So it's almost like a preemptive NDA, and I mean, those are really shocking.
And they're very common in the entertainment industry, as you can imagine, particularly for young talent, young actors, particularly now that there is this inflated content of streaming. So what a lot of the production companies do is they will they'll send scripts directly to actors rather than via an agent. And they'll say, if you want to audition for this part, you need to sign this legal document before you do so. So before they even see what the project is. So, you've got a young aspiring person who's just, starting out in their career. And in that first moment, they can be signing something they don't understand. And then they can be asked to do stuff on tape, because mostly it's self-tape. And this is a pretty vile form of abuse, if you think about it. They can be asked to do stuff on tape that they then can't take back or report. So they could be asked to simulate sex, to undress, to do all sorts of things, and they have no rights. And that's a preemptive NDA that is very common in the entertainment industry now.
So I have 3 questions, one here, one there, and then one up there. So you go first.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sonia. I appreciate it a lot. This is a great panel. I am currently a second-year law student in my 3rd year of law, and I find that I think we've all established that the law does not protect survivors or those who experience racial violence, discrimination. I find that legal education, even in this day and age, I took legal ethics last year, still lacks the understanding of how law continues to insulate systemic violence against survivors, and legal education, I think, still continues to do that, at least in my experience. Because when you look at the Law Society Code of BC, that's not what it's called, the Code for Lawyers in BC. My class has been so long talking about confidentiality and duties, solicitor-client duties, but so little about what that means in terms of those who experience violence and those who are forced into silence. I would love to know more about what you mean in your class, clients, because I think law should be a governance of relationships. And legal education still fails to do that. And I'd just like to know more, because I think, if you look at the population and diversity of who's in this room today versus who's in a law classroom, the profession is still so white.
Absolutely.
And I feel like I am failing as a law student, and if I become a lawyer, to do my due diligence, because my education doesn't reflect what I think is more important. And I love my law professors. This is not discrediting them. I just think that the institution is reinforcing the violence.
Charis?
I can answer that, yeah. I mean, as a bad law person, no. No, it's true. We have to constantly, push ourselves to produce, I think, curriculum that's more reflective of the change that we want to see. And, I know you've got great professors and that they're committed to that. So I think the feedback is important. We all, I think, share those goals. What I see is the profession also serving a very harmful role in, what you receive in law school, could be fantastic, could be better, but then when you get into the practice of law, especially private practice, for-profit practice of law, I think the pressure to adopt these strategies is very high. I'm trying to imagine somebody going into a law firm and saying, I'm not going to do it that way. Do you know what I mean? So I think as much as we need to do better in legal education, for sure, the change in the profession itself is going to be even harder. So that's specifically where I strongly believe that the legislation is necessary, because lawyers are not going to change anytime soon. But it is, I think, an interesting strategy, and this is a strategy that I'm sort of exploring in another area, which is with respect to malicious lawsuits, looking into the profession and the codes of conduct for lawyers and thinking about how do we improve them from some very bare bones principles to something that's more reflective of the ethics and the values that we want to see in the profession. So maybe that's a place to sort of channel some creative energy or some revolutionary energy is into the law society itself and the ways that what do we expect from lawyers, and maybe that's, since you're sort of toward the end of your legal education, that might be the next focus. But yeah, I think in legal education we always need to do better, and I think a lot of people are trying to improve the way that we approach a lot of these issues. But the profession is an even harder space to change, and that's where a lot of these really regressive approaches are normalized, as we've been talking about, and I think it'll be a hard change, and I think that's exactly why we need legislation. Yeah.
If I can just pick up where you left off, I completely agree on that, and actually that was always really the root of where I started my work. And just on a little bit of a positive note, it's not impossible to change, because there's a lot of change happening in the UK. From the very beginning of this issue coming to light, the regulators in the UK, so there's the Solicitors Regulatory Authority who look after attorneys, they put out a warning notice. They put out 4 warning notices now, and I hate to say I told you so to them, but I did say at the beginning a warning notice isn't good enough, because nothing has changed in guidance since '98, and nothing has changed in guidance. So the agreement that was made for me can still be made today and is still made today. But in the last 12 months, the oversight regulator of all the legal regulators in the UK, so they are above the Law Society, above the Bar, above the SRA, above all of them, did a huge consultation, and actually for the first time a legal body used our language, which was pretty extraordinary, because no lawyer really likes to say NDAs should only be used for IP or trade secrets. And the Legal Services Board, who are the Standards Board, who are the oversight regulator, said it has come to our attention that non-disclosure agreements are being used for things other than IP and trade secrets. How weird. And their report came back very conclusively, backing up everything that we've been talking about in our data. And this is making very big waves. And the Bar have now publicly come out saying, yes, there does seem to be a bit of a problem here. Obviously, it's got nothing to do with us as barristers, but there is a problem, and are pushing the government to make this a legislative matter. But overall, the law sector, and particularly in employment law, are thinking about this and talking about this all the time, whether it's for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. Those changes are being made. And, the Bar here in Canada also voted at a 94% vote that
they would discourage their members from using non-disclosure agreements.
So change is happening in the right places. It has to be legislative and regulatory, and these two roads are being taken.
I'll get Julie's syllabus and I will get it to the curriculum.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I actually want to say something a little bit more personal to you. This is obviously just my view, but I think that we're doing pathetically little in legal education to really equip people to deal with the human beings whom they will be working with and the issues they're going to confront when they leave legal practice. I spent all those years in law schools believing that we would change things, and frankly, they are they're performatively changed, but they're not actually changed. And to you personally, I would say, if you want to make a difference, your generation are going to be the people that will change the legal profession. Not what happens at law school, not what happens in the code of ethics or the regulations, but your generation are going to be the ones that change the profession. So go do it.
I'm just going to do one little thing, I promise. Okay, NDAs were created by I just have to say, on Julie's point, NDAs were created by lawyers. It is a lawyer-created problem. And we can change it. It is true. It is in our power, but it's a big fight. But it is totally changeable. I mean, it's not like, divine intervention. It's something that somebody created and it can be changed. So I really wanted to say that. Sorry, Jillian.
No. Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to ask a little bit about privacy law specifically in BC. So just for some context, I've worked in campus sexualized violence advocacy for a number of years, and something that we've continuously come up against is this issue with provincial privacy law, where survivors will go through their investigation process, go through all of the discovery, adjudication, all the things, and then at the very end, they'll receive no information, ultimately, about the results of that, or any of the sanctions and the findings, because that information is considered personal information of the perpetrator or the complainant. So I can imagine that in trying to bring forward legislation on non-disclosure agreements in a BC context, there may also need to be something done to privacy law, or that it is considered in relationship to privacy law. So I'm wondering if folks might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, we were having a very similar conversation here at the University of Victoria this morning. Yeah. And we're very accustomed to hearing privacy law being used as the excuse for continuing with NDAs. Those of you who've looked at FIPA here in British Columbia will know that there is a definition of what should be included in privacy, somebody's medical information, health information, so forth, and there are also many exceptions, including the public interest. Because this was what Thomson Rivers originally said, that, oh no, we can't possibly release the results, it's all affected by privacy law. So there might be a little tiny fragment of information that is protected by privacy law, but absolutely it doesn't protect the perpetrator from the outcome being known to the complainant. And this is a problem that is going on in the UK as well. We have an ally who's worked very directly on trying to ensure that complainants get a copy of the outcome. And I can tell you that here at the University of Victoria, there is also evidently some difficulties with complainants getting a copy of the outcome. And no, it's not all down to privacy law. That's just smoke and mirrors. There are some particular details that cannot be shared, but they are a fraction of the whole. And what we saw this morning, what we were shown this morning actually, was that nothing that somebody learns for the first time in an investigation can possibly be spoken about again because of privacy law. But that's nonsense. It depends on what it is that was learned. It's not just anything that was learned.
Do you want to add to that?
Thank you. I have something to offer, and thank you first. Because I think talking about this really is so critically important. And while we move to normalization, it's liberating, to do so as well. And I very much share, your aim. I'm going to share something very quickly to talk about this as well. So one of the times I was sexually harassed in my career, I came to learn that the man doing it had an illustrious history of sexual harassment in the organization. And he went to, and so he was emboldened, and when it's a prominent environmental organization in Canada, and the CEO at the time was former environment commissioner for the country, and my boss perpetrated something horrible to me in front of everybody too. So I had witnesses, as well. And after, the head of HR said to me, "It's horrible and unacceptable what happened to you." Nobody said anything, by the way. And I'm just always amazed at how little protection there is for you, even when it's happening. Even when you have witnesses, and it's not even a she said, he said, sort of scenario. And she said, "We know what's happening to you. We know that this isn't the only incident, as well. We have some legal things happening behind the scenes." But he was prominent within the United Nations, as well. And so she said, you can go after him, but he will come after you, right? You can make it formal, he'll come after you. So it's like you're just kind of left on your own, like, what do you want to do? And so I left, in a blowout, which was
kind of thing at the time, and kind of carried on with my life, and was really angered though, of course, because he wasn't going to face any measure of justice, right? And I did tell them what I needed to tell them, you know, I needed to swallow and made my exit, but, you know, it was relatively minor compared to everything he had done. And so a couple of years later, I got a phone call from a good friend of mine, and this organization has people that work all around the world too, so someone in her lab at McGill was working for him, you know, and he got fired. And the organization went so far as to actually write a press release about it. Not that he was fired, that was diplomatic language, but he can never go on and say he left. Like, they knew kind of what they were doing. It was like a very small measure of justice compared to everything that this person had done. So he couldn't walk away and tell his own story. He couldn't retire, you know, the way that he wanted to. And I thought to myself, okay, this is amazing. And it was January 14th, and so I decided to make a holiday about it. And I call it the Day of the Feast of the Just Desserts. And it's a day to celebrate the things that were wronged you in the workplace that they get what is coming to them. And I hope it's a bigger form of justice than what happened to this person. But I realized, as I told my story to my friends, we all have a story like this.
Yeah.
But often, there's never anything that happens to the person. So just explaining that something, even minor, happened to this guy, you know, kind of gave people hope. And so that's what I mean is that it's important to tell your stories. And I saw the movie, you know, too, which is really great, you know, you deserve to watch. So I just wanted to offer that to the room. If you need January 14th for yourself.
Thank you.
That was great.
I just want to say, all of this conversation, this is why women are choosing the bear.
We have time for one final question, so I'll give you that privilege.
My question has to do with the NDA's voices across industries. It was spoken to already in terms of Nike, but I'm just coming off of representing SD 61 at the Provincial BC School Confederation of Parent Advisory Councils, and one of the parents was speaking about how furious she was because there's a teacher who's perpetuated kind of gender violence on some students, was taken to the teachers have their own accountability space. That person was brought there, given like a 9-month kind of suspension, and is now working in another school district. And so part of the issue was that as BCC PAC, we have a representative, for example, who sits on that space, but it can't be a current parent. It has to be somebody who's outside of the organization, but they are not allowed to say one single thing about anything that happens. This is under the ministry and the BCCF, they choose the people. They're not allowed to say, they're not allowed to do a report back. They're not allowed to do anything at all. They're under complete, like, confidentiality. And so I'm just curious about how something like this, would it be applicable to something like school settings? And especially many of us racialized parents and other parents who have kids who have issues. If you've ever dealt with school districts, it's like, I don't know, Fort Knox. You're not going to get any information whatsoever. So I'm curious about that. And the secondary piece is how harm is defined. Because I've been watching everybody and I've read the language and it's like, harm, discrimination, everybody's like, and I'm like, but what may be harmful to me may absolutely not be harmful by you. And so what definition is being used for those words and in the different countries as well? Like, how are you all doing that? Because not one person here I've noticed has said anything about that. Everybody's just like, oh yeah, but what do we mean by harm? What do we mean by discrimination, etc.? So those are my questions.
Let me take the first bit, which is your question about the school boards. There's an expression, pass the trash, which actually came out of the school sector. That's how common it is for teachers to be passed to other organizations. And I've worked on a couple of cases before I was involved in the campaign involving teachers. And so anybody who, basically you're saying that this is a parent member who sits as part of the disciplinary process?
No, parents are not allowed.
Oh, okay.
We're a parent association.
Okay.
It has to be a former.
Oh,
member of the
okay.
association. You cannot be a current K-12 parent.
Right. But they're part of the disciplinary process, right? And so certainly my reading of the legislation is that yes, that would include them if they'd been asked to sign an NDA. And just to clarify, the legislation doesn't talk about no NDAs for harm. It talks about no NDAs for discrimination and harassment, and discrimination is always defined as in relation to whatever the Provincial Human Rights Code is. So there isn't actually a definition of harm.
No. Right, sorry.
There's only a definition of discrimination. Yeah, yeah. Just
harassment.
Yes, and harassment.
The only thing I would quickly say, I know we're already at time, is that, and this was something that I couldn't resist sort of putting at the end of my comments, is but the last two questions sort of touched on this really directly as far as I understood them, that there are huge problems with investigations themselves, whether or not it's the confidentiality, the private, whatever, how, you know, or the issues of lack of transparency in terms of result. And the dealing with the NDAs is important, and I think it's it's obviously a very hard struggle, even though it's such a defined, narrow topic. But I really believe that, the next battle is around investigations. And I don't have, I have lots of thoughts and lots of experiences when it comes to that, but I don't have any sort of magic solutions. But what I have observed repeatedly is that complainants, I don't want to say every time, but it's very common that at the end of an investigation, they feel way worse. Yeah. That the way that their harm or their experience is handled by the investigator is not even close to reflecting what they believe their experience was. Investigators are paid for by the powerful party. They're paid for by the employer in most cases. They have a vested interest in getting another contract after that contract. So there's all kinds of, and what I just said in terms of the privacy issue in my piece is that the investigation report was disclosed, 500 pages, on an exception in the Privacy Act that it was in the public interest, and that was defined by the board.
They just noticed that bit?
That was defined as confidence in the good governance of the university. And once I had the wonderful opportunity of reading this 500 pages, I was shocked at the awful legal reasoning. I can't even believe that lawyers did this, that they were able to accept this and that as acceptable. So, inside of these redacted investigations is some lawyer with, who knows what they've done. Who are those lawyers accountable to for that work that they did? That doesn't even meet, a minimum standard of diligence. So there's a lot, there's not just, the perpetrators being protected in that case, it's the actual lawyers who make, a lot of money. The TRU investigation cost $1 million to lawyers. So, there's tons of other work to do here, but I think the NDAs is really, Julie has sold me, that it is, I think the first battle, because at the very least, if we can stop the silence piece and how that's ingrained into legal practice, then I think the next thing we need to do is deal with investigations and find ways that are more, I think, about healing and, restorative justice and reconciliation and, finding, accountability. There's all kinds of other things that need to happen, but they aren't happening now. So anyways, sorry, long comment.
So it's a wonderful place to bring us to a close. I just want to thank you all for taking the time out of this night to come and share your stories. And we're going to be here for a little bit, for those of you that would like to come and chat a little bit more, or for whom this has been a hard moment. I encourage you to take some just desserts tonight. So
Charis's sons have eaten it all.
There are T-shirts and hats out in the hallway, so you can be part of making sure other people who, one of my experiences is that there's a lot of people in the place that I work that don't know what happened to me because of this, right? So I'm going to wear this T-shirt all day for the next. And also, please join me in thanking the extraordinary normalness of this panel.